Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Sermon. I'm Matt Hotho, the Director of Production and Online Engagement.
And Magrey de Vega, Senior Pastor.
All right, so Magrey, right out the gate, I gotta say that sermon that you just preached was phenomenal. And I don't mean that to just puff you up. I literally mean, like, if you haven't listened to this sermon yet, go back, listen to it, share it with a friend. It's the idea of, well, Magrey, you recap it for us real quick because it was your sermon.
Well, thanks. It's part of our series, Inspire. And I knew that when we developed this series, there had to be something about being an inspiration to others.
Yeah.
That if we are in a world where we're lacking inspiration, maybe we're the source of it. And it happened to coincide with MLK Weekend and the National Call to Service. So the idea of inspired to serve just seemed to fit.
Yeah, it did. And I think right out the gate, I mean, the way you set up what the opposite of inspiration is, right? Tell us a little bit about that, right? Like, because I think for some of us sometimes we're looking for inspiration, but we don't realize what we're actually in that moment to name it for what it is.
Yeah, well, it's a thought experiment that I did in preparation for the whole series. When I looked at the etymology of inspiration, where it came from, the sermon 2 Sundays ago talked about inspiration as being related to breath and breathing in inspiration from an external source. And when I was doing the etymology, I asked myself the question, well, what's the opposite? Mm-hmm. And this idea of disenchantment really stood out to me. In fact, I almost introduced it 2 Sundays ago, but I decided to hold off on it today. And it was also prompted by a conversation I had with a parishioner after that first sermon. He said, I always thought the opposite of inspiration was boredom, but it's not boredom. And that idea just triggered in me that it is. It's stronger than boredom. Yeah. It's a world where we believe that the world is not as it should be or could be. That's a world that lacks inspiration.
Yeah, and when I think about things that are enchanting, some other words or pictures come to mind for me, and it's things like light. It's things like brightness, right? You think about what makes the Disney so enchanting, right? And you think of fireworks, and you think of a lit castle and that kind of thing, right? And so I want to jump then to a little bit deep further in your sermon when you talk about Psalm 37, right? And the psalmist paints this picture of righteousness like the dawn and justice like the high noon. So what's the psalmist doing there? And what does that light imagery kind of maybe add to what they're saying?
Well, like many of the Psalms, it is a psalm full of contrasts between the way the world is and the way the world can be or should be in light of the grace of God. And what I like about Psalm 37 is it has no holds barred. It pulls no punches in describing what it calls wickedness in the world. And that language can be deeply resonant for anybody who is feeling like the world is not the way it should be. And it's a promise. There's an inherent promise from God that wickedness will not prevail. It will fade like the grass is one of the phrases. But also with that, it is coupled with this idea that we are not to be passive in simply letting God take care of all the wickedness in the world, that we have a role to play. And that role that we play are things that are strictly within our control. I mean, one of the things that we wrestle with nowadays, or that we should wrestle with, is what are things that we can control and what are things that we can't control? And we need to release ourselves from the things we can't control and just focus on the things that we can. And the great thing about Psalm 37 is it reminds us of all sorts of things we can control. That's why I say in the sermon that sometimes the most challenging words in the Bible are also the most comforting. Because as daunting as it is to hear these commands from God, it also reminds us that we are not powerless, that by the grace of God, we can do something. And so you take a look at all those phrases in Psalm 37. In contrast to wickedness, here are things that you can do. You can choose not to fret. You can choose not to be angry. You can choose to trust in God. You can choose to commit your way to the way of truth. And so when I was reading that psalm, frankly, in preparation for this sermon, MLK weekend, the inauguration day, when I read that psalm, happened to be on my birthday, I thought these are the words I need to hear. And I didn't expect at the time to include them in this sermon, except they wouldn't let me go. I mean, the Psalm 30, and then the song that came afterwards about creating your own sunshine, and then the biophotons thing. My birthday was 10 days ago, and I'd never started writing a sermon that far in advance. But I will say that the sermon that you all just heard, I finished last weekend, a week ago.
I could tell something was up. You were glowing.
I don't know what that means, but thanks.
Light, sunshine.
Were my biophotons show
Yes. Also, you were walking around humming "Pocket Full of Sunshine" by Natasha Bedingfield.
Yeah, why that song didn't show up on Spotify?
I don't know why that song didn't show up. That would have been a good one.
Yeah.
No, so to go back to the sermon though, I mean, like when you're talking about those images as well of lightness in Psalm 37, in MLK's sermon, his message, his hypothetical message of Paul to the American church, he sort of uses language of darkness, right? Calls racism and injustice the darkness in our society, which we know is true, right? And even today, there are things that we would say that's the darkness in our society.
That's right.
So I think in your sermon, you're starting to set up the difference between the dark and the light, the places of disenchantment and the places of inspiration. So then you take us into Galatians, where we've got Paul, who's excellent at just giving us very practical ways
very much
to
so.
do very practical things. He says, there's disenchantment, there's a vice list here, and then the ways to be inspired is the fruits of the Spirit.
Right. Very much in keeping with the stylistic writing of Psalm 37, a psalm full of contrasts. Paul's really good at contrast too, and that book of Galatians is filled with a definite wickedness list and a fruit of the Spirit list that couldn't be more in contrast with each other.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Yeah. So in that we find what we can do
to
bring inspiration into the world.
That's right.
So I think as we get ready to kind of land this discussion, for people at home who are wondering a practical way that they can make a difference, right? That they can inspire others maybe. You said in the online sermon as the prayer engagement, who's someone who's brought light into your life? Would you mind just kind of sharing a way that maybe someone has, when you've been disenchanted or you've needed a little bit more light in your life, someone's brought that?
Yeah, there have been several what we would call dark moments in my life, just as I'm sure everyone can identify those kinds of moments. And in one that I'm thinking of in particular, it was a very difficult, desperate time for me. And I reached out to a friend who said these words to me. I will believe, Magrey, he said, I will believe on your behalf until you can believe it for yourself. And that was a very powerful word of solidarity with me and an act of faith on my behalf when I felt like I didn't have it within myself to demonstrate that kind of fortitude, that kind of faith. And I've never forgotten that phrase. I will believe on your behalf that things will get better. I will believe on your behalf in the power of God. I will believe on your behalf that God is with you until you can believe it for yourself. And as an act of inspiration to others, I've often used that phrase in my solidarity with other people who are going through a difficult time, either as their pastor or as a close friend. I've used that phrase as well. I will believe on your behalf until you can believe it for yourself. So I'm grateful for that inspiration. How about you? Has someone ever been an inspiration to you?
Yeah, I mean, so recently in the last couple of years, I've gotten to understand what it means to just compete and to have the successes of competition and the failures of competition.
As a CrossFit person, yes.
All right, fine. As an adaptive CrossFit athlete, thank you, Magrey.
But sorry, your biophotons are showing.
Thank you. Anyways, so no, but this was all new for me, right? Like 2 years ago, I'd never done competitive stuff that used physical strength, and so when my body would let me down, the feeling of disenchantment that I felt there, to be surrounded by people who had been on this journey longer than me, to say to me, take a minute to feel it, and then start giving thanks for everything you've been able to do that your younger self would have never believed that you could do. And I think for me, for a while that manifested itself when physical things would occur, but now when things also happen like mentally, whether it's in work or raising my kids or life, I just remind myself that, man, 25-year-old Matt, you had no clue what you had coming. And it's all good. It's not like life beats you down. Because so often we can be told that, if you're not meeting a certain standard, life's beating you down. And disenchantment surrounds us all the time. Personally, and in your sermon was more of the systemic type of disenchantment, which I don't want to gloss over.
Of course.
But for that personal disenchantment, sometimes just reminding yourself the journey that you've been on, feel it for a second, for 5 minutes, set a timer, then go to being thankful for the things that you've overcome. Now, when it comes to that systemic type of disenchantment, that's where we need to engage with the world. Right. We need to engage with ministries or with nonprofits or activism in the world to make a difference.
Right.
I realize we're going a little bit long, but is there anything you want to say about that, engaging the disenchantment that's systemic in the world?
I think both are important. John Wesley would call us to both personal holiness and social holiness. As our friend Gary Mason would say, they are two wings of the same bird. We need to both care for our inner self and our own inner fortitude, and to care for our own disenchantment, as you've talked about, but also to make a difference in the world. Both of those things are necessary, and both are at the heartbeat of what it means to be United Methodists.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
On this Martin Luther King weekend, we're going to put a link in the show notes to Kingian nonviolence. Mm-hmm. It's 6 practices that Dr. King practiced as he was trying to build the beloved community that live on in his legacy. There's 6 practices that can help you think about how you might engage systemic disenchantment in the world in a way that's helpful and nonviolent, and you might find helpful for you as well. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.